Until very recently, groups such as the People's Temple and the World Church of God appeared to be mainstream religious sects. In the light of current news, many of these groups deserve a second look, I think. Jim Ryerson found one scholar who's been following Herbert Armstrong's church for some time now.
Dr. Walter Martin has been studying comparative religions for a quarter of a century. He first wrote about Herbert W. Armstrong and his worldwide Church of God in the 60s. He says, as with most cults, as he refers to the Church of God, people just don't understand what it is that Armstrong is preaching. Martin claims cults got their big boost in the 60s when organized religions stepped back and the cults moved in.
People go into these cultic structures because they do have a genuine spiritual hunger. They're looking for something I might add that they apparently haven't found in a lot of Christian churches. If in effect we had done what we're supposed to do at home, taking care of the sheep, we wouldn't have lost the large majority of these people into the world of the cults.
He says we may just be seeing the beginning of the cult movement. In the next 20 years, they'll be present as never before, and that incidents like Jonestown really won't be that much of a surprise.
Well, you're Mr. Controversy. You know, you stir up the devil, don't you?
Well, and I stir up a lot of people. That's perfectly true. But I think that part of the problem of the church historically has been that if you don't have any movers and shakers and nobody dissenting and nobody pointing things out, then you don't have any teaching ministry in the church because you teach by contrast. And the Christian church, his days of the church fathers till today, has been controversial. There's nothing wrong with controversy for the sake of truth. It's controversy just for the sake of controversy that's a sin.
Yes.
And controversy that speaks the truth in love is a biblical command. Let's get the record straight.
Okay, carry on.
The cults declared war on the church. We didn't.
I agree with you here. I agree with you.
We're supposed to respond to that, you see? Tell me why the Christian church should be silent in the face of those attacks.
So the whole thing we're looking at today is there's different grounds to take down this argument that we're seeing here in chapter 1 in Staff of Moses. One is, the theological meaning of the Bible. Two is kind of like the more reasoning area, where it's more like the dominant theme. They're trying to do this word equivocation game all the time, but very powerfully too, it's Ahnsahnghong himself also contradicted it. He never would have agreed in current WMSCOG doctrine or what's in chapter 1 here in the Staff of Moses.
And it's important to, again, keep in mind the reason we established for so long this book is because going back to his preface, we just read Ahnsahnghong say that the way to interpret Revelation and who the bride is that that's the saints. You go back to the preface and he says, this is the unchanging truth of God. You guys you have to do something with that. You don't just pass over that. That's incredibly significant. I think, too, in chapter 15, we can maybe talk about this for a second. In chapter 15, he also has this quote where he says, "The new Jerusalem will come down to this earth from heaven 1,000 years from now." So do you guys see any issues with the WMSCOG doctrine with what Ahnsahnghong says there?
Yeah, she came before the 1,000 years.
Yeah, it didn't take 1,000 years for her to come.
It took about, from the time this was written, it took about 10 years.
Okay. Okay, another quote I want to read from chapter 16. Ahnsahnghong says, let's read the Bible passage, the passages that Suen uses to claim that she is the only bride. If the matter at hand proves to be false, we must know that everything that she says is false. That to me is incredibly significant, because if he's applying it there, doesn't that apply to everything we're doing here with the World Mission Society Church of God? If we're finding something, if we're finding something here that the WMSCOG teaches that contradicts Ahnsahnghong from his own words, that means everything they say is false.
Right.
Well, Jesus said himself, he says, you'll cut down that tree. If the root is evil, you'll cut down the whole tree and throw it into the fire.
Yeah.
That's a quote from Christ in the Gospels.
Yep. So if we're finding something false, then here that the WMSCOG is contradicting Ahnsahnghong, that proves everything they say is false. Again, this is Ahnsahnghong's words at this point. This isn't us. This is Father that is saying these things. Okay, let me look. There's several other quotes here. Okay, so looks like I think in chapter 16 I had another one written down. I don't think I've read this one yet. But Ahnsahnghong says, "It is written that the Spirit and the bride say, 'Come.'" That's in Revelation 22:17. "It is true that the bride here is the same bride found in Revelation 21:9-10, since it is written, 'Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.'" And then actually there's this part after this that I want to read too. So he says, "The wife of the Lamb is the saints. Therefore, just as the prophecy of the bride stands for the New Jerusalem in heaven, and the New Jerusalem stands for the 144,000 saints." He's saying it over and over again.
Jordan, this is super important, right, to bring this up right now. So in the Staff of Moses in chapter 1, on the second page, there's a heading. It says, "The wife of the Lamb has two meanings." And what they're basically saying here is they say, yeah, you can, wife of the Lamb, just like the idea of lambs, has two meanings. Well, it's expressed sometimes as the wife of Christ, a different meaning depending on the context. And the real point they get to here is the wife of Christ can refer to the church, the saints, in certain verses that we, the opposers, quote. But the wife of the Lamb, who gives the water of life as the heavenly wedding banquet, which is exactly what Jordan's reading right here, this part only refers to Heavenly Mother. And that's the exact quote from the book. So that's kind of the three-stage, argument here. One is that what is the grounds of the opposers? Well, we're saying that the bride of Christ is always the church, not mother. Point number two, there's two meanings of lamb, just like, other words, they remember said Christ is the lamb, we're lamb, small l, different. And they're trying to do the equivocation game. And they say, see, wife of lamb has two meanings too. And the difference here is that this lamb in Revelation is obviously a second deity because she's the one who gives the water of life. Well, who did Ahnsahnghong say is giving the water of life in Revelation 22:17? The church.
The church.
And that's the whole argument they're trying to use here in Staff of Moses.
And it's interesting that they say, again, in the Staff of Moses, they say the wife of the Lamb who gives the water of life at the heavenly wedding banquet only refers to the Heavenly Mother. But however you view this book that Ahnsahnghong wrote here, what is clear, if you believe Ahnsahnghong, is that the only way to interpret who the bride is can't just be Heavenly Mother, because even if somehow you squeeze in the idea of Heavenly Mother after reading this, it's clear that Ahnsahnghong thought that the bride in Revelation can refer both to the saints, at least to the saints also. And so that quote in the Staff of Moses that this can only refer to Heavenly Mother is just one more thing that Ahnsahnghong directly contradicts, because his interpretation of Revelation here has nothing to do with Heavenly Mother, and it has everything to do with the saints.
Right.
So they're saying that concepts and words can have two meanings. We could turn that right back at them to say, yeah, they do. This is the church again. Burden of proof is on you to show there's why is another female deity. And the whole of Scripture says there's one God. The Jews believed in one God. Christians believe in one God. Christianity and Judaism are monotheistic religions. We're not polytheistic. And that's taught to every Jewish kid since he's a little kid. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. And they actually believe in two different deities. We're going to see that also later in Staff Book, where it's really clear. The church doesn't believe in one God with like a female-male part. They actually believe in two separate gods, one God plus one God, a male God and a female God. They are polytheists. You can't be a polytheist and be a Christian.
So another quote, Ahnsahnghong says, and I believe this is chapter 16, talk about the tabernacle. So he says, when this tabernacle, again, this is going back to a point we just covered. When this tabernacle comes down to this earth, it will be 1,000 years after the world has ended. When continuing to examine Revelation 21 through 15 carefully, it is seen that the prophecy will come to pass 1,000 years after the world has ended. The events mentioned in Revelation 20, 21 through 22 come to pass after the millennial kingdom. So this special attention must be paid to this point. Again, that's Ahnsahnghong's words that I just read, that he says is the unchanging truth of God. Ahnsahnghong is saying that the heavenly Jerusalem, the tabernacle, that will come down to this earth 1,000 years after the world is ended. So, Kelsey and Steve, has the world ended yet?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, they thought it was going to end in 1988 and
right.
2000, 2012, and no, it hasn't.
Yeah.
But we at least know that according to Ahnsahnghong, we still have at least 1,000 years till any possibility that the heavenly Jerusalem could come down to this earth.
Right. According to Ahnsahnghong, yes.
So what does that say about Zhonggil? So let me ask you this, Kelsey. So first, what would that say about Zhonggil and the truthfulness of whether she can be Mother God or not? And then with your member hat on, respond in any way you want to what's been said here.
Okay, so can you repeat the first question again?
Okay, so with this quote I just read and the other quotes obviously we've been reading from Ahnsahnghong, what does that mean? What does that say about Zhonggil first?
Well, according to what Ahnsahnghong wrote here, if the New Jerusalem were a person, which, it says here is referenced as a tabernacle, but if it were a person, the timing has not happened. So she can't be this tabernacle, this New Jerusalem, because, he wrote this in the early 80s.
I'll bring up an important point. Like, I heard this one critic of the Jehovah's Witnesses who talks about, the witnesses are living on the precipice of Armageddon. They try to keep them always in the sense of tension that Armageddon's right around the corner, living on that knife edge, that it could happen any time. And Kelsey would know better than anyone here that's what this group does. They kind of make you think you got to be a gospel worker. You got to get out there and preach. It's right around the end of the corner. It's no 1,000 years away. You just don't take your time to wait till, the consummation. You're living on that knife edge that it could happen any single moment.
Exactly. So, in regards to Jordan's question, it's like, the timing is not right according to Ahnsahnghong. So, whoever she claims to be, she is not that according to Ahnsahnghong's teachings. Mm-hmm. So, if you're a member and you believe in Ahnsahnghong, you're going to have to reconcile that fact.
So, with all these quotes that we've read in Ahnsahnghong's book, to me, this really comes down to, I think, for members, is that they have to choose between whether they're going to believe these very specific teachings that Ahnsahnghong gave or what the WMSCOG teaches, because you really can't have it both ways when you really honestly examine what Ahnsahnghong taught. And it's not just here, that Ahnsahnghong teaches about the identity of the wife of Christ. He gets into it in Visitors from the Angelic World about how Eve represents the church and stuff. And obviously they have responses to that. But Kelsey, kind of from this stuff we've said so far, like with the quotes we've given from Ahnsahnghong, kind of again with your member hat, like what do you feel like members would be? How would they be processing this right now? Obviously, they've got their defenses up, and what do you think those would be?
Again, I think people would respond to trying to explain how Revelation 19, 21, and 22 explain about the bride being God the Mother. Mm-hmm. I think that they would put a lot of effort into there. And to that, I would say, like, hold on. Yeah. We're going to get to that in future study. Like, the next study is all about Revelation 22:17. So we're going to get there. But I think that's how a lot of people would respond. Because
in their minds, like, they have these rock solid, what they think are rock solid arguments for why the Revelation verses are about Mother God. And they're intricately woven with other verses. And so a lot of this stuff it might be, if they're being honest, it should be shaking them, but those are going to be still pretty strong. And so, so again, I think what you said, two things. One, we're going to get to those, but two, you have to do something still with the fact that Ahnsahnghong, we're showing you his interpretation of these key verses that you're using to prove the doctrine of Mother God, and Ahnsahnghong interprets them in a way that actually agrees with our Christian understanding of these verses. And so that's a big deal.
And he states that, in his book, in the preface, again, the preface is very key, in that it's, the unchanging truth, which we already knew. And then also the reason why he wrote this book was to dispute the claims of Ahnsahnghong, or not Ahnsahnghong, of Suyin, and, people like her who are adding their own interpretations to the book of Revelation concerning God the Mother. He says he doesn't want this to, the specific words, let me see if I can find it. The specific words were, he says, you must take special care not to be deceived by these corrupt people ever again. So keep that in mind when, when this topic of this book comes up. And of course, we encourage everyone to actually read the book for themselves.
So when he
says, not just the excerpts they've been presented.
He says in the preface, in spite of this, women like Suyin have caused a great problem to arise with her corrupt ideas, and how can they be forgiven? So, in your guys' opinion, does Zhang-Gil-Jia fit into the category of women like Suyin?
Absolutely.
On the money.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna
they use the exact same verses.
The exact same verses,
and that he refutes.
Right. So you got to do something with that, and we'll get to the other arguments you might still have in your mind about Revelation and 19 and others. So the next section in chapter 1, it's called Two Meanings of Eve, and we want to make a few quick comments about this.
Well, it's actually under the supplementary explanation.
Supplementary explanation. And so what is it, guys, that they're arguing for here? Kind of sum up. Well, let me just read this last statement, because I guess it kind of summarizes it. So last paragraph here, it says, firstly, Eve refers to the saints, and secondly, to the bride, Heavenly Mother or Mother God, who appears as the Savior to lead the saints and give them the water of life at the end of 6,000 years. In other words, Eve has two meanings. Since Eve, who represents the wife of Christ, refers to both the saints and the Heavenly Mother, the wife of Christ too indicates both the saints and the Heavenly Mother. So what are they saying there? What are they trying to get across?
Oh, what are they trying to... What's the point of them saying this?
What did they just say, for those who might be struggling to follow that?
Right. And how they just... Even though the Bible doesn't, specifically say Eve has any kind of meaning outside of who Eve was, they use Adam in the verse in Romans chapter 5 verse 14, which says Adam is a pattern of the one to come. They use that to explain about, Adam represents Christ, so his wife Eve must represent someone as well.
And I think if you're in their mind, they're probably thinking, okay, well, Adam represents a deity, like a Christ who is God, so therefore Eve must also represent a deity. Right? Do you think that's they're kind of thinking that way?
They're creating a typology here. And I'm very careful about typologies, because unless the Holy Spirit says this is, you can have an opinion like saying, hey, this seems to be a type of this, but to state it dogmatically, say this is absolutely this, without the Holy Spirit making it clear in the New Testament, I think you're on dangerous ground, especially to build a doctrine on those grounds. So they're trying to, it's kind of a word equivocation game and a false analogy. I think this is a way to set yourself up. You can build a lot of things from silence, and it's just a dangerous way to do doctrine.
Yep. So this gets into like philosophical argumentation and right and wrong ways to do that. And so like a false analogy, kind of an example that you can just pull up if you search for that on Google. It's an example of that is say Joanne and Mary both drive pickup trucks. Since Joanne is a teacher, Mary must also be a teacher. This is flawed reasoning. So that's if you just look up the definition of a false analogy, which is just a description of a fallacious way of arguing, like a illogical, irrational way to argue.
And then you can plug this into that same scenario. Just because Adam and Eve, they were together, Adam represents Christ, means Eve must represent a deity as well. It's the same situation.
And it doesn't follow. It doesn't work. You have to step away from rational, logical way of arguing and depart from that in order to come to that conclusion. And it's not to say even that. It's not to say that proves it's not true. It's just to say you haven't established that. You have to show us that before you just say it. You have to prove that, because
Jordan, the way they do that is through the use of transitions. And we had talked about this in an earlier episode. So if you haven't seen the episode, so what they do often is they'll take a verse and they'll say, this means this, and they'll take the verse as it is. Then they'll take a totally unrelated verse, but they try to combine them by what they call transitions. Every member knows this. Kelsey did it. Often people have trouble with their transitions. They got to practice. They get that transition down to flow. And in here, there's no connection between Adam having Eve and, Christ having Mother God. It just doesn't exist. But they try to make a transition. And if you can show how the transition's bogus, that they're basically, you pull the transition away, this false analogy, it's basically two unrelated concepts with nothing to do with each other on standalone verses or concepts. And then unless there's a transition connecting them, it's nonsense. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to put this transition for the members to say, if this is like this and this will be like this, you knock out the transition, everything falls apart.
Yep. And you see that, when I've sat down with them in the past and talked with them and listened to their studies and listened to them explain and prove their doctrines, you see this so clearly, but it's hard to catch sometimes because it's crafty, and it's like, we always call it sleight of hand, which is really what it is. And it's like you said, they start out with these two completely unrelated things, and they know, okay, I have to somehow figure out how to connect this being like a verse or a scriptural idea. I have to find a way to connect this to this. I have to way to make Eve picture a second deity. And obviously I can't just jump to that. So I'm going to find another Bible verse in the scripture that can kind of ease that transition, make it an easier thing. So if I can I can start with this, and then it's like rather than this jumping there, it's like they grab a verse that's another unrelated verse, but seems a little bit more like it fits in, and they put another step in there. So it's your mind doesn't like jolt when they connect these two things. It makes it easier to take it in, and it seems more reasonable. But if you step back and look at what they've just done in a critical way, you see that they've just connected three completely unrelated things that might appear to be related, but they've connected it in a way where they formed a doctrine from a terrible way of
false analogy.
Yeah, a terrible way of looking and interpreting scriptures.
I don't see Eve at all as the church. I don't see that in scripture. It's a type. If you want to believe it, you can believe it, but I wouldn't build a doctrine on it. It's not explicitly taught in the New Testament. You might say it's implicit by typology. I think to build the doctrine that there's a second deity other than the one deity, the Father, upon this, through this bogus transition thing, is dangerous theology. You can build any doctrine you want on this, guys. And again, just like we said before, this is theologically refuted, the idea that there's a plurality of gods. So many places in the Bible. I mean, we'll get into that in a future episode, but just read Isaiah 42 to 46 and underline everywhere where it says there's one God, and you're going to run out of ink. I mean, it goes through it again and again and again that there's only one God. So theologically, this is going to get just destroyed.
I think the problem I would have with it is that, to me personally, it's impossible for me to not question things and question what I believe. I question what I believe every day and analyze it, probably to a fault. And so if I was a member, I would not be able to help but think but wait a minute. The only time Ahnsahnghong ever mentions Eve or the wife of Christ, he only ever says it's the saints. And so for me personally, if I was a member, I would have a really difficult time not like having a real struggle with that and asking the question, why is it that Father only ever says that the wife of Christ is the saints, and now the WMSCOG comes along after he's dead and says, oh, well, no, actually the wife of Christ is a second deity, something that a concept that was totally outside of anything Ahnsahnghong ever taught. Not only was it outside of what he taught, it was something he directly refuted. And so if I was a member, I would really struggle with this.
Well, where did Ahnsahnghong get the idea that Eve are the saints anyway? And it seems like he might have used that as a typology, but they're building a doctrine. The church, after he dies, is building a doctrine on his typology. Mm-hmm. So, but where did Ahnsahnghong get that idea from anyway? It's not found in scripture.
Well, also, I want to point out, too, that for that book, members haven't read that book. 99% of members have not read that book. So, though they might be, told the contents of the book, seeing what Ahnsahnghong actually said, I think is a whole other level.
Yep.
And so, Ahnsahnghong made it very, very clear that the bride is the saint. Very, very
And
clear.
they're also cherry picking, again, which part of Ahnsahnghong they quote. I mean, they're not exactly going to quote the problem with the New Jerusalem, the bride and the veil. So they're not going to quote that. They're picking where they want to try to support their doctrines. And that's what they're doing right now with this idea here, with this Eve being the saints, which is just, nonsense. Yep. It's like saying, did Jesus ever kiss his mother? Well, you can't build a doctrine on anything. It's an argument from silence, and this is an argument from silence. You can't build doctrines, deities, which is salvation oriented. This is a salvation doctrine. It's not like a peripheral doctrine. This is a salvation doctrine.
Right.
And you're going to base it upon some typology.
Yeah.
Right.
And base it on scriptures that Ahnsahnghong used to refute the very idea that you're trying to support with those scriptures. So if you want to, this would be a point where I just encourage members to first go and read Problems with the New Jerusalem, the Bride and Women's Veils, and ask yourself the question, if you're being honest, who do you think Ahnsahnghong really believed was the wife of Christ? And even go and read chapter 13 of Visitors from the Angelic World and compare and contrast the two, see how they correlate, see how they back up each other and showing, and this actually Visitors from the Angelic World just kind of goes to show the fact that Ahnsahnghong did believe that what he taught in Problems with the New Jerusalem was the unchanging truth of God, because it's something he continued to teach, not just in that book about the identity of the wife of Christ, but he taught it elsewhere, which shows that Ahnsahnghong's views of who the bride of Christ was didn't change. It didn't change after the removal of this book. It's something he consistently taught and thought.
I think that's a very good point that you just brought up, is that it wasn't just that book that he mentioned, that the bride, or in this case Eve, right, represents the saints. I think that's a very, very good point.
Yep.
It was also in a book that's widely distributed in the WMS.
Right. Yeah. If you want to say this book is just temporary, the Problems with the New Jerusalem, well, the same concept, you see him repeating that. And so there's pretty strong arguments to be made that no, he continued to think this way.
If we have people who do come on Christian television and they look right into the camera and talk to millions of people, and they say to you, dogs beget dogs, and cats beget cats, and God begets gods, and you are little gods, that is error and it is evil.
Well, I think you're right. And also, the fact that you're here tonight, counteracting it, is producing a balance in the theological presentation
May
of Christianity.
produce a scaffold, too.
It's true.
Will you have these men on your program? The ones that would they come on your program?
I would love them on my program. I would love, and I have a very large and effective program by the grace of God. I'd be glad to have them on.
So the second supplementary explanation that they give, so that was number one. Number two is titled, Secondly, Adam and Eve represent the Spirit and the bride. And so what are the things? There's a couple things I think we wanted to pull out of here. One is that they compare the animals. Basically, they say that the saints of God, the people of God, are represented or symbolized by Eve and the animals. So Eve is both the saints, or the saints are both Eve and the animals. Is that correct?
The saints are both Eve and they're saying here that the saints are both Eve and the saints are the bride who leads the animals.
Who leads the okay?
So the animals are the Gentiles; they're not part of the church.
The animals are the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They're not members of the church.
Okay, so you guys jump into that a little bit. That concept and again, I mixed that up. So they're not saying that the saints are represented by the animals. They're saying that the Gentiles.
The Gentiles are the animals. It's a typology, a metaphor like the animals, while Eve is the church. So Kelsey, why don't you explain a little bit how they teach this
I'm
in
sorry.
the created order?
So they say here, maybe I'm reading this wrong. It says, in other words, the saints who will be saved are represented as the animals. So they do kind of connect.
Contradicts.
They do kind of connect.
Contradiction. Yeah.
They do kind of connect the saints. They do say the saints are the animals.
So
but then on the last page, they say it's the Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, I think what they're trying to say, and this is what I think that they're trying to say, is that when he went up to heaven, he said, preach to the Gentiles, right? Preach to Samaria and all the earth. So the gospel's been open to the Gentiles. So those who receive the truth, those are the ones that are the Spirit and the bride are going to preach to the Gentiles, right? And the Gentiles are going to receive it and go to heaven.
Which is the members of the WMSCOG, basically.
Yeah.
Who are represented by the animals. And so you could say, though, then that
but it's actually
the saints are represented by both Eve and the animals.
Yeah.
Here.
Which
is
a
interesting.
whole another contradiction because they teach that and I have notes from 6 Day Creation where they teach that there's a difference between human and animal. Humans are those who have knowledge of God. Animals are those who do not have knowledge of God. And they use Psalms chapter 49 verse 20 to justify that explanation, that people who do not have understanding are those who are like beasts, like animals. So they teach that animals represent those without knowledge of God, but then here they say, and like you mentioned, in other words, saints who will be saved are represented as the animals. So that's actually a contradiction in their teaching, and members will recognize that.
Now, Kelsey, what do they say about creation as far as Adam and Eve being our first parents and how that ties into the animals?
They do not believe that Adam and Eve are the first two humans created. They teach that Adam and Eve are the first two to have knowledge of God, but that even before Adam and Eve, there surely existed other people. And to justify that, they show, where, there's Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, right? Cain killed Abel. So if Adam and Eve were the first two humans on this earth, right, then that means at that point there should only be three people, Adam, Eve, and Cain, right? But Cain, as a result of him killing Abel, God sent him to live in another land. And God said, whoever kills him, they'll be punished, right? Mm-hmm. So, but the thing is they say well, who's going to kill him, right? He's in a different land than his parents, so there's only three people. Right. Who's going to kill him?
Who was in the earth?
Well, that's the reason. That's a fallacy because they can have other descendants later to do it. So,
well, also they say Cain eventually got married and had a wife, right? Where did his wife come from? Did he marry his mother? That's what they. So that's how they explain it. They don't really go much in detail past that, but yeah, that's the understanding.
So what that presents though is this idea that before Adam and Eve there were people on the earth. And so I think there's kind of one major point we wanted to make here with Romans 5 and something maybe, Steve, that Romans 5 would say about that. So maybe go into that problem a little bit. Why would that present a problem?
So the idea of having a pre-Adamic race So they would say these are like the animal-like people who didn't know God. And then Adam and Eve were the first people who really knew God. That's why they were the first people. So to have a pre-Adamic race would be to say that there was a group of people who lived as beasts in rebellion to God has a huge problem with the idea of the fall. Because theologically and biblically, it says sin came to Adam. I got Romans 5:12 says it very clear that just as for one man sin entered into the world and death through sin, death spread to all men and because all had sinned. So how would that work if you had people before Adam who were living in sin? Because the Bible clearly says that sin first came through Adam. It didn't come from this rebellious animal group of pre-Adamic people. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a huge theological problem for the Church of God. They haven't really thought this thing through. They've basically taken another argument from silence, saying there's pre-Adamic people, which is nonsense because, clearly Adam in the New Testament and Christian tradition, Adam was the first man, and God created him. And as far as the timeline in Genesis, and sin came through Adam, and it wasn't through any pre-Adamic race. That you have to really butcher the scriptures and twist it to hold on to this pretty crazy doctrine that they've talked about this pre-Adamic thing. It's just not in scripture again.
Yep. And I think so. With that said, the last thing I'd want to say, I think, to kind of wrap this up, would be, I remember, I think probably the first conversation I sat down with members, and they did their Bible studies. One of the things they went to and put a really strong emphasis on was one of the parables about a wedding, where there was the wedding, and in that parable you had both the bride and you had the guests of the wedding, and so they emphasized
the bridegroom and the guests,
the bride,
no bride,
right? And there's places where they emphasize that the I think it's in Revelation actually maybe too, where you see the guests and the bride, and so they'll make this point that well the bride can't be the guest to her own wedding, and basically what they're saying is, you can't have both of these symbols representing the church in the same setting. And so I would say to that, well, you guys have just done the same thing here in saying that Eve and the animals both represent the saints. In this same location in the Bible, you're saying that both Eve and the animals are representative of the saints. And so I'm not sure. I think I'd be interested to hear. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if you see any holes in that. But when I came across that in this book, it just kind of stood out to me because I remembered how strongly they emphasized that point. And it seems I think
that's a really good point because, first of all, the Bible doesn't say Eve. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't say Eve represents anybody, right? And so their logic to pull that out. So they're saying, again, without any Bible verse, that Eve represents, the saints, and then also Eve represents God the Mother, right? But the thing is how this is different than the word lamb or the word bride, right? Because the word lamb and the word bride are actually written down, and they have specific examples of where they go to in the Bible to say, hey, in this verse, lamb means Jesus, in this verse, lamb means God's people. But for Eve, they don't have specific places where they can go in the Bible and say, okay, in this case, Eve represents God the Mother, or in this case, Eve represents the saints. They're saying that Eve... Mm-hmm.
Well, finish your thought.
Well, they're saying Eve jointly represents the saints and also represents God the Mother. And I think that's an important point to... Oh, yeah, and the Gentiles, right?
I think, though, what they would do to support the Eve idea is they would go to places like, I think it's 2 Corinthians, where it talks, which this place doesn't work that I'm about to mention, where he says, Paul says to the church, I'm afraid for you that just as the serpent deceived Eve, so also your minds may be deceived. So they probably point to that. They probably point to the analogy between Christ and the church, where Paul says, as a father or as a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife and are made one flesh. So that's something Paul applies to the church and Christ, which obviously comes out of Genesis between Adam and Eve. And so I think off the top of my head, those are the only two places I can think of. But the 2 Corinthians one is not intended at all to make the church be a type of Eve. It's just a simple comparison. Like he could have as easily said, I'm afraid for you that just as the serpent deceives Peter to deny Christ, so also your minds might be deceived. But if he did that, it'd be the same argument, but it doesn't mean he's saying that the church that Peter is a type of the church or something like that. Yeah. But so I think those would be the places maybe they draw from. There might be others, but I think ultimately that the fact that they get from that to a second deity, a second God, that's the issue. That's the real issue.
There's no verse that says that. They're using the verse in Romans chapter 5, verse 14, where it says Adam represents, a deity. Therefore, Eve, his wife, must represent a deity also, where it, again, doesn't say that.
But they're doing it in two ways, because in the first part of chapter 1, they're saying that the wife of the Lamb has two meanings, and they're basically saying, the bride of Christ, which is spelled out in Ephesians and in 2 Corinthians 11, they're saying that the bride of Christ is not only the church, but it's also a female deity. And then they're doing the same thing with the Eve, saying it's not only the church, it's also a female deity. So they're doing it both, and both times they're doing it, they're just kind of assuming what they're trying to prove with no basis to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. Well,
Which is theologically contradicted, as we're going to see in later episodes.
Right.
They're polytheists.
Yep. Well, I think that gets us pretty well through chapter 1. I know there's a lot more that could be said about it, but I think we're gonna touch on and build upon some of this stuff in future episodes covering this. But just in summary, just to summarize the kind of the main points I think that we went through. One, we don't necessarily have a problem with the idea that there's different meanings in the Bible to the same thing sometimes. Fine, that's fine, no problem with that. But I think the leaps they go to in that's where it becomes problematic. Another point we made is that Ahnsahnghong very clearly told us the identity of the bride. He very clearly told us multiple times, not only in the removed book, however you view that, although he clearly said it there, he said it also in Visitors from the Angelic World, a book that is still with you guys. And so you have to consider critically, honestly, who did Ahnsahnghong say the church was? Why did he, or the bride of Christ was? Why did he always say it was the church? You can't ignore that. Another significant point is that Ahnsahnghong said that the heavenly Jerusalem would not appear till 1,000 years after the end of the world. Okay, that's a big problem, and that immediately counts out Zhang-il-Jia from being able to be the heavenly Jerusalem. And he said that all these things, these quotes that we've read, he said these are the unchanging truth of God. And he said that you must be careful not to be deceived by these corrupt people who would teach these sort of things about using these verses in Revelation to teach a mother God doctrine. He said, be careful that you are not deceived by these corrupt people ever again. Ever again. Are you going to listen to that, or are you going to ignore that? Then, as we just mentioned, with the Eve being the representing Mother God, they're relying on so much philosophical, fallacious way of arguing. They're relying on false analogies, equivocation fallacy, in order to make Eve represent Mother God. They're basically just saying it's true because we say it's true, and we think it's true because we think it's true. They're not proving it. They're not establishing it. And they're not necessarily laying out their entire arguments for that, obviously, in this first chapter. But they certainly, nowhere here do we see them establishing that. And then the last thing we covered was just the animals, the way they use the animals as a type of the saints or as the Gentiles. There's multiple issues I think we're seeing that arise from that. And so with that, do either of you guys have any final closing thoughts?
Steve, you can go.
Not so much. I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, we're just getting started in this book. I think it's a couple of things. One is the actual arguments to use, but, and theologically, but it's also just a way of thinking for these people. It's just like a sloppy way of thinking. It's believing it because your leadership tells you to think this way. If this equals this here and this equals this there, then this has got to equal this. It's just like a really sloppy way of thinking. They're not great theologians. They're not great biblical thinkers. They make terrible fallacies that a baby Christian wouldn't make. They're not experts in language, none of that stuff. They just don't have the tools or the understanding of Bible. They make basic mistakes, and I think just the sloppy methodology is the first part of this lesson here.
And I just want to add, I was there too. I was a member, and I believe that was the truth. But I just encourage people that, if you really believe what you know is the truth, then don't be afraid to look into the Bible and see the context in which these verses are written, so that you can confirm for yourself whether what you're being taught is the truth or not. Because we're coming at this from a biblical standpoint, and I don't know the right word, but even with understanding like false analogies too. So we're presenting to you, what, I don't know how to say it. Biblical evidence that, what you are being taught is not correct according to the standpoint of the Bible, which, as all members, I think all members, like we mentioned before, all members, they don't join the church just to join a church, right? They join the church because they believe in the Bible. They want to know God, right? And so, I would say take that initial, hope and desire and, look. Don't be afraid to look into the Bible, because there is an explanation, a solid explanation that the bride is not God the Mother. There's a solid explanation about that in the Bible. And again, even within the context of Revelation 19, 21 and 22. Which, again, I know it's going to be tempting to want to explain those verses right away, but we're going to get to those the next chapter is about Revelation 22:17. So we're going to get to we're going to analyze that through the Bible within the next couple of videos. But just bear with us, and what we said today, really, look through the Bible yourself, open up your Bible and see what we were trying to convey. So.
Yeah, don't like Kelsey said, don't be scared to look at the Bible. Also, you can understand the complicated things by the clear things. And the clear things is there's not two gods. There's one God. And there's internal contradictions we're going to get to about their view on the two gods thing even, because sometimes they'll say, well, there's two aspects of one God, and other times they'll distinctly say there's two gods. There's another fundamental contradiction. You'll hear that from leaders and in their writing. We'll get into all that stuff too. But, the clear things explain the harder things, and that's the nature of God. It's pretty obvious. Don't build, word games, equivocations. Don't do arguments from silence. These are important issues. And, the church has been around for 2,000 years. Jesus promised the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against it, and they never did. And it did not be restored in either 1948 or 1964 or 1985. The church has been around.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you want to read the books, again, as we said, the links to Ahnsahnghong's book, the Problems with the New Jerusalem, the Bride and Women's Veils, that'll be in the link of the video. And we ask that you would subscribe and do all that kind of stuff that helps us out. And especially if you're listening on the podcast version of this, to leave a review. That's just a really helpful way that helps push our content out in front of more people. And so those are just a couple practical, helpful things you can do. And then also, if this is like one of your first videos as a member you're listening to, just want to let you know that we've kind of are building a pretty big library at this point. I think we have around 100 videos or so just on this topic of the World Mission Society Church of God. And so there's links to that too, the link to the playlist for that in the description if you want to hear more. If you want to listen about other specific topics, we've covered a lot of stuff over the past 3 years. And so, with that said, we'll look forward to doing the next couple chapters soon and going through this whole book. And thank you for watching.
we have a right to respond to them.
That's true.
Now, I'm having Dave on my radio program for a couple of hours. Now, he and I do not agree in specific areas. And he's wrong in specific areas, as far as I'm concerned, biblically. Now, why do we not have an open discussion where we sit down and we say, okay, Dave, you make a statement in Seduction of Christianity and you name the book. You talk to the guy and you say, well, how do you defend that position? How do we discuss it? You guys did that one night here on pre-, mid, and post-tribulationists. Remember, where you sat around and discussed the differences of opinion? Was anybody choking anybody?
No.
Was anybody jumping up and down on anybody?
No, I think it's...
Was it unloving?
No.
Was it divisive? No. It brought everybody together because the body could sort it out. He knows exactly where I stand. He's my friend. I love him. He's coming on my program. We're going to talk 2 hours. He's going to pound the table and disagree with me. I'm going to disagree with him. But at least, Doug, in the name of sanity, the First Amendment, and truth, people are going to hear both sides.
I like that.
I think that's fair. See?
But you're not doing it just for controversy.
No.
You are doing it to purify the doctrine.
No.
God raises up men like yourself to be salt and to be light in the theological circles. And we have to accept you, even though we may not like everything you say.
Or even like you personally. The important thing is it true?
That's true.
That's the most important thing. Is it true? Now, if it's true that this is false doctrine, and it is,
Then we have to address the issue and counteract it.
then we address the issue.